The truth is that what makes you succeed as a writer online is just the ability to have interesting ideas, to convey them in a clear and understandable way, and to do that with some regularity. But welcome everyone to Why Founders Should Write. I will present for about 30 minutes. I'll take some Q&A at the end. I'm also, I guess, somewhat infamous at On Deck internally for my ability to respond to questions in the Zoom chat while presenting. So if you want to try me on that, feel free to throw your questions in there. First up, here is what you can all expect today. I'll tell you who I am and why you should listen to me. I'll talk about 5 reasons that founders should write and publish online. I'll talk about this idea about how you don't have to be good at writing to be good at writing. I'll talk about some easy ways to get started. I'll talk about one random idea that only partly fits in this presentation, but that I think is important. This is a good opportunity to throw it in there, and then Q&A. So first, who am I and why should you listen to me? And by the way, never trust anyone who presents to you without having a slide like this. So I was one of those people who wanted to be a writer for as long as I can remember, ever since I was a little kid. Went to school for it, graduated and had some early stuff published, and then pretty quickly realized I didn't actually want to be a writer. I think in the way that a lot of really young people, you have a vision of what sort of a job might be like, but then when you actually do it, it turns out the real thing isn't quite like that. I just realized that I like collaborating with people too much. I like working with others, and I had a level of ambition that felt hard to achieve as a young writer. And so I took a random, unexpected left-hand turn into startups. I moved to Detroit through an entrepreneurship program called Venture for America, bought and restored an abandoned mansion, which you can see here. And that led to starting a real estate tech company called Castle that raised a bunch of money from some big name investors, some of whom you see on this screen. Also hired as an early employee, ODF GM Barry Conrad, and 2 other members of the On Deck team, including our head of partnerships, Lauren Hoffman. But despite some early success, eventually imploded spectacularly. After that, after about a couple years in the wilderness of just getting de-stressed after 4 years of being a very burned out startup founder, I joined the On Deck team last summer to build and run the On Deck Writer Fellowship. A couple of fun facts about me. When I was 19, I was one of the youngest candidates ever to appear on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, but I'm not a millionaire. I write my own email newsletter called My Super Secret Diary that is about, let's see, what do I say it's about? It's about startups, literature, American history, philosophy, sex and drugs, and how to be alive. I run an adult summer camp every year called Funopticon, sadly canceled last year, but back this year, actually with one of my old co-founders. And a couple years ago, I finally achieved my long-held dream of winning the New Yorker cartoon caption contest, which means I can say that my writing has been published in the New Yorker and I'm technically not lying. So that's me in a nutshell. Thanks, Christina. Yeah, and we'll be sending some links out after this. I have some associated materials. Important preface to this talk. We all know that writing well helps you do email good and bullshit like that. I'm not here to tell you about the super basic ways that writing can help you. Obviously, if you're a founder, you sometimes have to put words together. And I hope it's fairly self-explanatory that being good at it will help you do that better. This talk focuses on what I hope are some more unique insights about the benefits of writing for founders. So I'm going to take you through 5 key insights about things that writing and publishing your work helps you to do that I think are really valuable for both current and aspiring founders. The first is that it helps you develop intellectual honesty. The second is that it helps you get comfortable shipping early and often. Little Suez Canal there joke, if anyone is following that. Third is that it helps you build a relevant network. The fourth is that it can help you develop a unique point of view. And the fifth is that it can help you establish credibility and expertise. So let's dive into these one-on-one. First one I want to highlight is the way that writing and publishing your work helps you develop intellectual honesty. Y'all have probably heard the phrase, make something people want. It's YC's motto. It's probably the simplest way to summarize what you need to do in a startup. And that applies to writing as well. But it's hard to be honest with yourself about whether or not people actually want what you're making. I'm sure some of you have experienced this in the process of creating your startups. I know that I certainly did. It's really, you're constantly trying to strike the right balance between, on the one hand, you need core conviction as a founder and you need the ability to power through even in the face of setbacks, but you also need to be brutally honest with yourself about whether or not what you're doing is actually working. And writing and publishing regularly helps you practice this loop, right? When I think about how do you improve some of the skills as your skills as a founder, one of the most important ways you can do it is figure out what are like the quickest iterative loops you can get into where you get to practice that skill over and over with real world feedback. And if you commit to like writing and publishing a piece online, every week, you'll very quickly learn to figure out whether or not the product of your writing is something that people actually want. And I think that helps build a mental model and a set of mental techniques that are just as valuable for building a product or building a company. The second is that writing and publishing your work helps you get comfortable shipping and get comfortable shipping early and often. You've probably heard this famous quote, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product, you launch too late. Well, I have a similar version for writing. If you're not embarrassed by the first thing you published too late. Writing and publishing regularly is a forcing function to get over your perfectionism. I experienced this with my weekly email newsletter. Basically, the reason I write a weekly newsletter is that I want to force myself to write and publish regularly, but I'm also always very embarrassed to show my writing to the world, especially if I haven't had a long time to work on it. I don't really know a good way to get over that embarrassment. The only thing I know how to do is counteract it with even larger potential embarrassment. And so I publicly announced that I was going to write a weekly newsletter. And then the embarrassment of publishing something that I think is maybe kind of half-baked or that I'm just, a little scared of is just outweighed by the embarrassment of potentially missing my stated weekly publishing deadline. So many founders suffer from perfectionism and from not shipping early enough. And I think writing and publishing regularly is a really great way to help you get over that kind of perfectionism. Writing and publishing is also a great way to build a relevant network. Everyone hates networking, and for good reason. It fucking sucks. Writing and sharing your work online, aka sharing ideas and adding value to the world, is way better than random meet and greets or awkward networking events. And most importantly, it solves the awkward follow-up problem, right? I know I've had this experience of like, you meet someone at some type of situation, you're like, oh, this would be a person who'd be good to have in my network. Guess I should figure out some way to keep in touch with them. Maybe you send some email to them and it's like, well, nice to meet you, but like, what do you do from there? If you're writing and sharing your work, if they're reading your work, if you're reading and connecting with their work, it helps you stay in touch with people who you've met in a much more natural and engaged way. A great case study for this is a company called Upstream and a guy named Alex Taub. Upstream is it's hard to describe. It's sort of like a professionally focused social network that is designed for like different kinds of referrals and other professional connections, sort of like biting off one little chunk of LinkedIn. It can be really, really hard to bootstrap a new social network, right? How do you solve the chicken and egg problem? Well, Alex solved it he wrote a blog called Alex's Tech Thoughts for a long time before starting this company, made a bunch of relevant connections that way, had sort of a group of readers. He was able to turn a lot of those readers into early users of his product when he started Upstream. And the thing that's really cool about this, and one of the things that I love about writing in general, is that it's not like he knew definitively that he was going to be starting this exact company when he started writing his blog, right? He built a somewhat broader, more general audience that he could then refine into being specifically helpful for this company he started. But if he'd ended up innovating in a different direction or launching a different kind of product, he probably could have still built off of the network that he'd created. Next up, I think writing and publishing your work is really important for developing a unique point of view. Starting a successful company requires a unique contrarian insight, right? You have to hold some belief about the world that is really powerful to you, but that at least the majority of people probably don't already believe, because if they did, someone else would have started that company. And writing is a great way to explore ideas and figure out what you actually believe. And I want to emphasize here that I think this doesn't just apply like before you've started the company when you're trying to figure out what's the first insight that your company is going to be based on. It's a continual iterative process as you figure out new directions, new ideas, new insights to build your company. And the writing process often helps you separate bad ideas from good ones. I can't tell you how many times I've thought I had a good idea just from thinking about it, but as I tried to write and really flesh it out, you realize that actually it wasn't as good as you thought. I think writing is an absolutely phenomenal tool for that. And lastly, writing and publishing your work is a really important way to establish credibility and expertise. Writing about a topic obviously helps you learn about it yourself. It also makes your expertise legible to others. this is a really common path for, let's say you're starting a health tech startup and you don't necessarily have the level of, healthcare experience that makes you legible as credible to the broader world. Writing publicly about healthcare or health tech is a great way to develop that expertise and to make other people feel like you have that expertise, which is often equally as important. And it takes a surprisingly little amount of writing to actually make this happen, right? I'm not even saying you have to write a weekly newsletter about healthcare tech in this hypothetical for a year. Having like 3 great articles on your website is probably all it takes. And one thing I really emphasize here is that expertise isn't a prerequisite for writing about a topic. It's actually the result of writing about a topic. People often think, oh, I don't know if I can write about this, I'm not an expert. But people become experts through the process of writing about things, right? You can write from the perspective of a beginner learning things. You can write as if you were an expert and just do the necessary research and you'll kind of become one, basically. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that writing develops expertise. It isn't just how you show expertise that already exists. I'll use myself as a case study here and give a little plug for my free seed fundraising book. I think Mike Wilner, my co-author, is going to come do a talk at ODF if he hasn't come already. But basically, Mike is Mike already did a talk, so you've probably heard a lot of the content in here. Basically, the short answer is, after Mike and I have been good friends for a long time, started our companies at around the same time. And when those companies failed, we were looking for a project to work on together. And we felt like that there was all this fundraising advice out there, but none of it was really targeted at the people who we were when we had started our companies at 24, right? There's so much great fundraising advice about like, how do you negotiate term sheets with investors? But like, when I was 24 and starting a company for the first time, that advice was so far ahead of what I needed. I needed advice that was like, I just started the company. I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't even know what an angel investor is. Where do I start? And so we wrote this guide to seed fundraising for founders in that situation, which I definitely recommend you check out, and you should watch Mike's talk too if you haven't already seen it. We obviously had some level of expertise when we started writing this book, because we had our own experiences. But we had, through the process of writing, we discovered gaps in our own knowledge that led us to seek out other people and get their insights. And once we published the book, quote unquote, we just made it available as a free ebook. All of a sudden, everyone perceived us as experts. It comes across as it's kind of a funny thing in the way expertise is perceived. Like just walking in and be like, oh yeah, we wrote a book about fundraising. Everyone's like, oh wow, they must be experts. Even though like we just wrote a free PDF and published it online, which like any idiot could do. But people are still very impressed, I would say almost irrationally so, by the act of writing. But it created a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where then, because we had written this book and were perceived as experts, we ended up in conversations about fundraising, and people shared their ideas with us way more than we otherwise would have. That led us to actually gain even more expertise that we put in the next version of the book, and so on. And so I use our experience here because I think it's a prime example of having some level of knowledge about a topic and developing expertise and presenting as experts through the process of writing about it. And yes, Eliza, I can read the chat and present at the same time. Wanted to throw in a bonus 6th reason in here, which is just that I think writing is a generally satisfying way to become smarter and more interesting. One thing that's awesome about writing is it lets you keep your identity multivariate. I found this so strongly as a startup founder that like the startup becomes your whole identity. And I think it's really important to fight against that at least a little bit to prevent yourself from going totally insane. Having a public presence where you write online about things that aren't just your company or just your industry is a really great way to remind both yourself and the world that there is more to you than your company, even if it is, the majority of your identity. Plus, it just helps you feel good about yourself and, nourish your soul and commune with the universe. I often come to different On Deck fellowships and give these presentations that are very directly focused on the practical benefits of writing. And I think there are really a lot of practical benefits. And I don't like to come in here and be like too woo-woo hippy dippy, but I also think that writing is a really beautiful thing to be done for its own sake, that it has a lot of pleasure and almost spirituality to it. And I don't like to give a talk that's all practical and not at least mention that. So there you go. Okay, I want to talk about this really quickly, which is this idea that you don't have to be quote unquote good at writing to be good at writing. And what I mean by that is, I think way too many people so many people I talk to who are concerned they're not good writers, they lack confidence in themselves, and they are really thinking about, like, oh, well, I'm not lyrical, I don't have the ability to write beautiful sentences. The truth is that what makes you succeed as a writer online is just the ability to have interesting ideas, to convey them in a clear and understandable way, and to do that with some regularity. That isn't usually coded as good at writing in our society, but that effectively is being good at writing. And you know what? If you do that for a long time, you probably will get better at putting words together in a beautiful way. So, there's more to being good at writing than just, what you might think being good at writing means based on, like, the most literary person you know. And the other thing I want to mention is that most of the benefits that I talked about earlier accrue even with a minimal audience. I work really hard to make this the case in my presentations, because I think we all get, okay, sure, if I write a blog about something and it gets 10,000 readers, obviously really good things are going to happen. But most of the things I talked about in this presentation will happen for you even if almost no one is reading your work. Some of them happen purely on the individual level. Some require only a relatively small direct audience of people who are in your industry or who already know you personally. And so nothing I said here requires, becoming a famous or well-known blogger or anything like that. You can get a lot of it out of just the act of writing itself. So let's talk really quickly about how to get started. The most important thing is just to start. I cannot emphasize this enough. When it comes to writing, most planning is actually just procrastination. It's almost the exact opposite of being a founder in that sense, where obviously as a founder, you do want to have a bias for action, but there's some level of planning that's actually important. With writing, truly, I have so many conversations with people about, like, what platform should I use? What should I write about? Blah, 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 blah. And, like, that is almost all just procrastination. Having said that, let me give you a few practical ideas that I think can help jumpstart a beginner writer if you're looking for inspiration. One idea is to send a private newsletter to a few friends to take the pressure off. If starting a Substack feels too intense, find 10 friends, 10 people in your network, 10 people you think would want to read your stuff, and just email them on BCC with your work, and do that until you get comfortable. A couple other sort of go-to ideas of things to write about. One is take a question you're asked often and write the answer as an article. Anytime I find myself having the same conversation more than a few times, I'm like, oh, I should just write this down. It's a win-win. I don't have to have the same conversation over and over. And also it helps my advice scale. Or another good one is just explain a recent decision. A classic one for this is write an article explaining why you're starting your company. That will, hopefully you won't have to think about it too hard. If you have to really think through your thought process while writing this article, it's probably a sign that you have some more thinking to do about your company in the first place. And it's something that can be a helpful exercise for you. It can be a great thing to follow up with people when you meet them. Like if you meet someone at some event, you tell them about your company, great to have a go-to follow-up blog post about why you started it. So those are kind of just a few go-to ideas I'd recommend. Okay, here's the random idea that only partly fits in this presentation, but that I think is important anyway. I give a lot of deck and fundraising advice, as you might have gathered because I wrote that book. And the most important single piece of deck advice I give is that you should build your deck in writing fully before you touch Keynote. This is only loosely related to the rest of my presentation, but I think it's a great tip and it is about writing. So I figured I'd spend 2 minutes on it here. A good fundraising deck tells a coherent story. And the best way to make sure that yours does is to write it as one. Starting with a presentation encourages sloppy thinking, which is why Bezos banned PowerPoint, if you read about that at Amazon. 99% of the time when I review someone's deck, it's a total mess. One of the problems is that they started by making the deck. So here's my 3-step process for deck making that can't fail. The first is write your story out in headlines, like literally in a Google Doc or on a piece of paper. Then add a few supporting bullet points to each headlines. And now you should have a literal 1-page story where if you just read it in order, it like basically tells the story of your company and your fundraise. And then go put your headlines and details into deck form. And there's a link here, which I'll send out after, that elaborates on this process in more detail in my newsletter. So there's your bonus piece of deck advice for the day. Hope that was helpful. That's it. Turn it over to all of you for questions. Thanks so much.
Amazing, Max. Thank you so much. Want to open up the floor to any questions that folks have here. And we're just going to do it. If you want to raise your hand or just come off mute, feel free to just give Max the shakedown.
Hey, Max, that was awesome. This is Alex. Do you ever have people work with editors that they find online, like Upwork or Freelancer, that sort of stuff? And do you recommend that, or is that just like a sign that your writing's terrible and you should?
So great question. It's not a sign that your writing is terrible. I do know a lot of people who work with writing coaches. Basically, so it depends on the context, but I would say basically my answer to this is that having worked now with hundreds and hundreds of writers over the years, most people, the job of helping them improve their writing is as much psychological as it is educational or editorial, if not more so, right? Like I always joke at On Deck Writers that we're way more like coaches or therapists than we are editors. So I think where an editor from like Fiverr or Upwork can come in handy, like when you just want like a really cheap editor, is if you're publishing something for your company or even just on your personal blog and you're just like, I want to make sure the grammar of this is right. I want to make sure it doesn't have any typos because it's in a context where I need it to look really professional. In that case, sure, maybe you want to spend $50 to have someone just like do an edit. But in terms of, an actual good editor is not just doing like a copy edit or a proofread, right? They're helping you tease out the themes in your article or essay, make it more clear, make it more compelling, helping you understand what you really want to write. That process is very interactive. It's not something that I think can be done well by just like the kind of person you'd find on Fiverr. Even if you talk to, I have friends who are editors at publishing houses, and like they will say that honestly, they're basically like therapists or they're writers like moms and dads sometimes, right? There definitely are private writing coaches who can do a really good job at that. But it's obviously a much bigger type of commitment and engagement. And so, yeah, my TLDR there is like, working with an editor on Fiverr or Upwork can be great as long as you understand you're just getting like a cheap proofread and that has value, but it also, is what it is. Dangerous. I'm gonna struggle, make sure I do not accidentally take my shirt off mean girl style when I take the sweater off. All right, we're safe.
Thanks. David, you had a question.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Max. I wanted to just quickly ask your thoughts on sharing, call it an op-ed or thoughts on a specific topic versus personal life stuff. And the context here is I've had a newsletter for a little while, try and remain consistent with it. Sometimes I fall off for a month and I feel the need to kind of share why, a little bit of a personal update before going back into things. But I often, and maybe this is just an insecurity, feel like if I share things about my personal life, people will be like, I don't care about that. I'm here to learn about a specific topic, unsubscribe. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. It's a really common thing to feel. I talk to tons of writers who struggle with the same thing. I think it is almost always misguided. It makes sense. We are all scared to share ourselves, like in any context. It's like the most common, deepest human fear. But especially when it comes to newsletters, I do think people want some level of personal engagement, because one of the beautiful things about the newsletter form, and I think one of the reasons that it's taken off, is that it feels intimate, right? It's like the writer is sending you an email, even if they're writing, right? Even when I opened like Stratechery, it's like, oh, Ben Thompson's emailing me, I think obviously depending on your audience, they don't necessarily want too much detail. I mean, my newsletter is like very personal. I tell a lot of like pretty detailed stories from my life. If you're writing about, Canadian politics, they probably don't want to know the details of the fight you had with your significant other. But I think a few notes up front, just about like what's been going on, are always appreciated. I also really enjoy a lot of newsletters I read that are mostly about like intellectual, non-personal topics. There'll still be a little bit of personal stuff explaining like why the person was interested in that. I think this is also something you experience in a lot of real journalism. I mean, if you read the New Yorker, their articles are, I would actually say, quite personal in the sense of like they will be deeply reported pieces of research, but they also tell the story of the writer doing the research. They use the first person, and I think that stuff can be really interesting as well. I have never heard anyone ever complain that someone's writing was too personal, unless it was like a situation that like is obviously TMI, that I think like you will know if you're crossing that line,
Cool. And that's super helpful. A real quick follow on. Do you think it's ever valuable to send an email that's strictly kind of a personal update, or do you always think it should be personal plus, whatever it is that you're writing about? Only in the sense of like, hey, if you've gone missing for a month, is it worth sharing like why, or should you wait until you're ready to start publishing again?
It totally depends. I think that it really depends on the context of your newsletter. And I would say the two sort of contexts are, one is the two sort of things to consider are, one is how strictly themed is your newsletter to begin with? And the second is how regular and important is it to your readers, right? So if your newsletter is like, I mostly write about tech, but it's sort of just like whatever's on my mind, and I think you can pretty easily be like, well, actually, what's on my mind this week is just like, I got a bunch of shit going on. That's why I haven't heard from me. Whereas, and then similarly, if you've like really trained people to expect a newsletter from you like every Friday at 5 p.m. and you miss one, they're probably gonna be wondering what's up. There's a great story that Polina Marinova, who some of you guys might know, she writes the profile, that she had told me and told the On Deck Writer cohort about how she established such regularity with her newsletter that one day it was like she finished it at midnight and she said she scheduled to send it tomorrow, but she didn't realize that since it was like 12:02, tomorrow was actually like 2 days from now. And like 5 people emailed her when it didn't come out being like, are you okay? Right? If you don't think your readers will even necessarily, if it's not so regular, you think your readers will even have noticed that it didn't come, then I would say like just wait. I think also if it's been a really long time, like let's say you write a weekly email newsletter and you go dark for 5 weeks. At that point, probably don't even bother reaching out again until you're ready to write, because people probably don't even remember. Then to get some email from you, and it's like, oh, by the way, I've been busy, sorry, you still won't hear from me again. It's like, okay, this was like a waste of my nuts, right? So I would say, yeah, not one size fits all, but those are sort of the different factors to consider and whether it might be appropriate for you.
Super helpful. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, David. Chip, you want to hop up here?
Sure. So I had 2 questions. One is really around, you mentioned platforms before. So, the thing about if there's any guidance you have on platforms to use, I think there's newsletter versus blog. Like, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you see those 2 things differently, because I think I primarily hear you talking about newsletters. And then I think the other one is just around like, the other question I had was just around like length of what's too short of a blog post or newsletter that it might not be worth it. Because I think that's one of the things that I've always had as a barrier, is like, I feel like I've got to sit down and do something that is pithy and like this long. And that really holds me back from just being able to sit down and like type out something that, would require a lot less mental energy and time.
Yeah, so great question. So first off, in terms of platforms, frankly, I usually just say newsletter because they're pretty big right now. Obviously, the whole newsletter blog distinction is like 90% not real anyway, right? You can read, if you visit a Substack newsletter page, you read it like a blog. You can get a blog by email. I personally, I think on the margin, a newsletter gets a little bit more read with a little bit more regularity, in the sense of like more people who read your newsletter will actually be subscribers versus people just visiting your blog every now and then. And any individual blog post is probably a little bit more likely to like be forwarded around or quote unquote go viral than a newsletter article. But like that is on the margin. It's like a 5% difference. I usually tell people at this point that to just get started with a Substack, only because it's like the absolute easiest way to get started. But I generally think any platform is fine. The only platform I actively recommend against is Medium. And the reason is that with Medium, you don't own your audience. So what I mean by that is that like on Substack, you can actually see the emails of the people who are receiving your Substack. And this is true for other newsletter platforms as well. And when you send an email, it's like going to those people. With Medium, it's much more like Facebook in the sense of like you publish something, it's sort of at the whims of their algorithm. And if someone like you have no way to contact your likes or follows on Medium off Medium, so you're totally beholden to Medium. The upside is that it is easier for a piece to go viral on Medium, but like you don't want to be basing your platform strategy around just hoping that you're going to go viral. The one reason to use Medium is if you don't want to write regularly. Medium is nice because you can just go, like if you want to write one thing on Substack, you have to create a Substack and then create a post. But on Medium, you can just like post something. That's why like every tech CEO who doesn't have a blog, but like one day wakes up and has something they want to say, like Brian Armstrong at Coinbase publishing that piece about how they wouldn't engage with corporate politics, basically, like just post on Medium. And yeah, Jesse, I think it's a good point. I've seen a lot of people who use a blog or a Substack occasionally cross-post on Medium and use that to pull people into their newsletter or their blog. So it can be useful as sort of a secondary distribution channel, but I wouldn't make yourself totally beholden to them. In terms of length, if anything, I think people actually like stuff that is really short and to the point. I subscribe to a number of newsletters that regularly have articles that are like maybe 3 or 4 paragraphs of 3 to 4 sentences each. I think anything that feels too long to be a tweet is appropriate to be a newsletter or a blog. And I absolutely wouldn't think that it needs to be long. If anything, most of the time, I much more frequently read people's writing that I think is too long than read people's writing that I'm like, oh, this was too short. They should have expanded on it. So I think we often have in our heads that like long writing becomes like more serious, right? I mean, that's why everyone is so impressed when they see like a really big book. But a lot of times like that just means that the author was a bad editor.
Can I ask a real quick follow-up on the platform piece? Where do you see LinkedIn fitting into this?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. So LinkedIn, it's similar to Medium in the sense that you don't, own your audience in that way. But it is different because but it's different because LinkedIn, because that isn't their primary business, there aren't, like, I think there are sort of some real perverse incentives for Medium about like really owning these writers and making it hard to leave Medium and stuff. Whereas like with LinkedIn, yeah, you don't own your audience, but it's like more of a side feature. I would generally say is, if you want to write, 2 to 3 to 4 paragraph things, and LinkedIn is just going to be the easiest, lowest friction place for you to do it, go for it. But longer term, you probably want to think about moving off of LinkedIn because it's not really a good place to have. It doesn't really provide a permanent home for your writing, right? The upside is that people you're connected to on LinkedIn will see your writing. But if you just wanted to send someone like, oh, here's everything I wrote in the past 6 months, what do you send them? Like your LinkedIn feed? There's not really a good, sort of place for that. I think what a lot of people do successfully is cross-post on LinkedIn. So I cross-post all my newsletters on Twitter and LinkedIn. But what you could do with LinkedIn is actually, Twitter, I might just write one sentence and have the link. On LinkedIn, you could actually pull a whole excerpt, or even if you were writing like a 3-paragraph newsletter, you could even cross-post the whole thing on LinkedIn and then be like, here's the Substack link for the permanent home for this. The other downside of LinkedIn is that it's harder for someone to share your post with someone who isn't on LinkedIn. Obviously, most people are on LinkedIn, but still like, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn, but like, I don't ever check it, right? So like, if I wanted to send a piece of writing to a friend, I wouldn't want to send it to them on LinkedIn because I'd be like, they never look at these messages. But again, I think with all of this platform advice, and even on Medium, the most important thing is just to write. So if it's going to be way easier for you to just go on LinkedIn or even on Medium and just type something out, then set up a Substack, like just do that. I've never heard of an amazing writer who failed because they were on the wrong platform. These differences all matter at the margin.
Thanks, Chip. All right, Brian, feel free to ask away.
Hey, Max. Thanks so much. So my question is around copywriting versus writing, right? And so, no one's going to read your thing if you don't have the right copywriting. And I'm wondering, do you have a couple maybe go-to rules or like frameworks that are helpful for you when you copyright, or are there resources that you know of that you think are worthwhile to check out to bolster that skill as well?
Yeah, so my number one sort of go-to rule and resource is that those two skills aren't as different as you'd think. And I will say this applies to situations where you are the founder or have a lot of power. Obviously, there are a lot of companies where you might be in a corporate copywriting job where like what you need to do to succeed in your job is do writing that I would consider bad. But in speaking to an audience of founders, I would say those things are not that different. And honestly, almost all of the tips that make for good writing make for good copywriting. Really clearly understand what you're trying to say. Understand what your audience wants. Be really concise. Don't be too clever, right? I mean, I can't tell you, and this was something I did so many times when I was younger, that we would come up with some great copywriting idea that we thought was like really clever. I remember we were really into, so my company was like a full stack property management company. We made, we basically managed rental properties for landlords using software and on-demand labor. And we were really into this idea of like one-click landlording at one point, right? So, God, it's like such a cool vision, so catchy. No one understood what the fuck that meant, right? It didn't work at all. And like way simpler, like direct communication is just way better. And I will say also, this obviously doesn't really apply to like, there are exceptions to this rule, which would be something like, you know, like fashion, for example, or like certain kinds of like cool or like sneakers. Like there's certain kinds of products where like you actually want to, or like what Arby's is doing with their social media, right? Where you like want to be just nonsensical and inscrutable. But I think those are the rare exception. Like for 95% of founders, just like relatively clear, not too clever, concise communication that understands your audience is basically, yeah, Steakums. Oh my God, their fight with Neil deGrasse Tyson recently was amazing. I think the rules are like 95% the same. The two sort of exceptions, the two pieces where copywriting is different from regular writing that I would say are really important. One is, so I often think about writing on, what's interesting, one of the things I like about writing as opposed to just like building a product is that you, like in my writing, I will sometimes be like, well, this might be not exactly what my audience wants, but it's what I want, and fuck it, like this is my writing, so I'm gonna do that, right? Whereas like with copywriting, you just don't do that at all. You really are just trying to go exactly for what your audience wants. And the other thing I would emphasize with copywriting is that I think you have even less room to be flowery or descriptive or use like clever or beautiful language. You probably want to be simple and direct to a point that is probably overkill even for some actual writing, where you have more room to occasionally sort of play around with language. But generally speaking, I don't think they're that different. And I think that most of the bad copywriting that I read, it's because it feels like someone was like, ooh, I'm going to try to like do copywriting. Like, let me turn my advertising voice on, you know? And I think a lot of the best copywriting really just reads as like good writing. And I would say, by the way, Stripe is, I think, one of the best examples of this. Not surprising, both of the Collisons are really good writers and value writers and value writing. And if you read their website, or even their API documentation is really well written, but like if you read their website, it just like, I mean, I just pulled it up right now, and it just like, there's no like marketing or copywriting speak on there at all, right? It's literally, it's like barely different from a Wikipedia article about Stripe. It just like clearly and concisely explains what they do. I think they're a great example to look at.
Thanks, Brian. Harish, I think you're next.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Max. So I think I have this issue of, as you mentioned one thing before, like do not have something to write maybe every week or like, you know, in regular cadence. So during that time, it might be one thought is to have someone like a guest author, or, you know, someone to interview and to share an article with them together. So is podcast a way to go, or do you see something can be done with the newsletter?
Yeah, I think both. I think having guests on newsletters and podcasts can be both really effective. What I think is great about having a guest with writing is that it's often you can conduct the interview or the conversation asynchronously, and it's often a lower ask of someone's time. And it also can be easier for them to share. So for example, like speaking at least personally, I'm not like the busiest or like most famous person by any means, but I periodically get asked to do interviews and podcasts. With podcasts, I'll basically do it if it's someone who I think would be really fun to talk to, because it's like it's going to be at least an hour commitment. Whereas with an interview, a written interview, I'll basically do it with anyone because I can usually just like almost exactly copy and paste this answers to the same like 10 questions that I've been used before, and then like write new answers for like the 20% of the questions that are new. And so it's like fairly efficient. The other thing that I think can be really nice about that is that you don't have to do, you can be a little bit more open-ended, right? You could, like with the example of a guest post, or you can say, hey, is there like anything that you want to talk about? And that's a little bit easier than doing that in writing them in a podcast where the person would have to like prepare more. With all of these things, it's a harder sell if you don't have much of an audience yourself, because ultimately that's sort of the incentive. But I think they work both really well for both the written form and podcasts, and sort of each one has different benefits, upsides and downsides.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Harish. Ryan.
Thanks. My question was kind of a, I guess like a tactical one around like, I'm doing a lot of like learning, so I'm accumulating a lot of notes, and I'm like, oh, this could be like a good post, but I don't know how to come up with like a pithy angle on it, or like a hook essentially for the idea, without maybe like workshopping it with somebody. So I'm curious if you have any like techniques for doing that solo.
Sorry, maybe I missed it. Would you mind just repeating that one more time so I make sure I understand the question?
Basically like, so I'm working in healthcare, and there's a lot of like research that goes into it, and I'm like, man, I wish somebody else wrote this blog post so I didn't have to do this research.
Yeah.
So aside from just like publishing my notes openly, turning it into something that has an angle and a voice, and like builds brand instead of just being like a post-it note.
100%. Yeah, great question. So there of course are a ton and tons of different angles you could throw on that. But my go-to advice for people in this situation, the easiest angle I think to take, is literally the angle of your post is like, how come this doesn't exist? Why am I the first person to have to do all this research? And I think you can turn your notes into like an article that has some narrative flow, literally by just, and this is kind of a very low end, sort of low rent version of what like New Yorker authors do. Just like tell the story of what happened. Like literally the article is like, and here's the context on me. I wanted to know this stuff. I went looking for articles like about this, but I was like, well, these don't exist. That's ridiculous. So then I did all this research, and here's how I did the research. Here's how I figured out where to look. I don't mean anything too crazy. You're not like outlining your entire note-taking system, but like, did you just do a Google search? Did you ask someone? How did you tell what sources were good? Then you wrote all this stuff down, and this is sort of what I did. And so therefore my main takeaways are X, Y, Z. And then maybe you like link as an addendum to like, and by the way, here's my full notes if someone else wants them. That's sort of like that's like the lowest common denominator article structure that you can put on having just done this research process. And in my experience, at least, it becomes like 10 times more engaging than just reading someone's notes, even though the 95% of the work is actually doing the research, which you already did.
Cool, thanks.
I think I saw one question in the chat too from Akshay, I hope I'm saying that right, about any tips on establishing a practice of writing frequently and making it a habit. So I'll throw that, I'll address that, and then if we have any more questions, we can dive into them. I mean, I can tell you what's worked for me, and I don't know if this will work necessarily for everyone else, but I will say that for me, there are really only two things that ever work for building a habit. One is to do it incredibly regularly. Like for me, I'm the type of person who, I usually work out 3 days a week. I'm pretty consistent about it. If I missed a whole week, it might be like 3 years before I started working out again, you know? And so it's just like, do it, and like never miss a break. I also similarly, the other rule that really helps me is, so again, to use the gym analogy, I have a rule that if I wake up and I'm tired and I really don't feel like working out, I still have to change into my gym clothes. And then if I change into my gym clothes and I step outside and I still decide I'm too tired to work out, I can take my gym clothes off and go back and get back in bed. But like 75% of the time, by the time I put my gym clothes on and leave the door, I'm like, all right, fuck it all. I'm already here. I might as well go for a run or whatever. So I do the same thing for writing. If I'm not inspired, I really don't feel like writing. The rule is that I have to get up and go get my computer or a pen and paper, and I have to write 100 words, but it can be like I can directly copy them from somewhere else as long as I type them out instead of copying or pasting them, or I could literally write like fuck this 100 times, or I guess 50 times, because that's 2 words. And same thing, like half the time when you do that, you'll end up just writing. So it helps you like reduce the threshold for cheating. I personally do a lot of my writing on a really old computer, a 12-inch PowerBook G4, if any of you remember those. That's so shitty that it can't really go on the internet. That also was like, you know, I desperately wanted that computer when I was 14, but it was like $4,000. And now I could buy one used for like 75. And I was like, yeah, my 14-year-old self would think this is so cool. But I think it also helps context switch. Like, it's too old for me to be distracted. I'm not at the same laptop that I'm using for like all my work stuff. And then the last thing, and I mentioned this earlier, but for me, the number one thing that has enabled me to write regularly is just committing to writing a weekly newsletter, because the shame of having made that commitment really publicly and then not publishing is super motivating in a way where if I was just like, I'm going to do it just for myself, it would have been way too easy for me to just, you know, not do it and make excuses. So your mileage may vary. I think these questions are so idiosyncratic and personal, but that's what's worked for me.
Awesome. Any other questions before we wrap up, everybody? Cool.
Cool.
Well, Max, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Sorry,
thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for having me.